Hello, everybody, and welcome back to In Good Spirits. As promised, we have got video set up now, so you can all see my lovely face. For those fortunate to watch on YouTube, for those unfortunately listening on Spotify and Apple, you will be able to fall asleep just listening to me rather than watching the video itself. But thank you, everyone, for the support so far. The podcast has been absolutely great in terms of the feedback I've been getting, the kind of comments that everybody's been giving, and just the general growth of the channel has been fantastic. I just kind of set this up just to kind of talk through investments and just give my point of view and just to hear all the positive feedback about people being interested in the industry a lot more, my experience of it, and talking through some ideas that they'd like to hear me talk about on some topics. It's all been really, really positive, and it's all been really, really kind of interesting to hear. So thank you, everybody, for the support so far. Season 2, kicking off. Episode 1, we're going to talk about tariff cuts in India and a new era for Scotch, or just the hype. So I'm your host, Tom Ballantyne, as hopefully you guys know. But for those of you who are new to the channel, new to the show, welcome. And today's topic is a hot one. India has announced major tariff cuts on Scotch whisky, a headline that's already proving to get a potential game changer in the industry, and one that I'm sure many people in the industry are talking a lot about at the moment. But is it a big thing? Is it not a big thing? I'm just going to put my own thoughts out there and some things that you should look out for. And what is it, a hype, or is it something that is genuinely good for the industry? And at the end of the day, should you put your hard-earned money into looking at more whiskey investments? Because is this overall positive news going to be significant for whiskey returns and whiskey investors? And that's what this show is all about. So earlier this week, or a couple of weeks ago, probably by the time this podcast gets released, the UK and India signed a free trade agreement that includes a major reduction in Scotch whisky import tariffs from a whopping 150% down to only a whopping 75%, with a roadmap to potentially reduce it down further to 40% over the next decade. So over half cutting immediately, and then another potentially cutting again of half again, which is absolutely incredible in terms of pricing, and is going to certainly shift the pricing of Scotch whisky in India majorly. Not going to touch too much more on tariffs and the general how they work. I think a lot of people would have known about the Trump tariffs and how he was going to charge 100% on anything and everything everywhere around the world that's not American. But I would encourage anybody to kind of look into what tariffs are and how they get passed on. But the simplest thing about a tariff, and to explain about a tariff, is it's a tax for a good when entering a country. So if I was selling my Scotch whisky into India, in this example, we would expect 150% tax added to that bottle of whiskey. And so penetrating markets like that can be very difficult for any product if you've got 150% tax increase to fight against local products. Now, your product might be significantly cheaper, so maybe it doesn't affect you as much, but in the grand scheme of things, they're not 150% cheaper. But this move is being hailed as a massive breakthrough for the whiskey industry, with India being the largest market for whiskey in the world by volume. This deal could open up enormous new demand for Scotch. Most experts, especially the Scotch Whisky Association, is quoting. And investment companies are very quick to respond on this news. One whiskey cask firm sent an email within an hour or two, I think, into my inbox and said the agreement's been signed, and kind of quoting, "This isn't just a win for distilleries, it's a win for whiskey drinkers, investors alike. It's a game changer for the whiskey cask industry. Cask values are set to rise immediately as India opens its doors to the Scotch world." All that kind of marketing jazz, which they're not wrong in some components, and they should be excited for it because it is an exciting time, but it's potentially not the whole truth. And it's stuff that I will certainly allude to later on, that whilst I think it is positive overall, and it is a good thing to look out for whiskey drinkers and whiskey investors in particular, it might not be as impactful as people think. So, as mentioned, India's agreed to cut the import tariffs down from 150 to 70%, then down to 40% in the next 10 years. And one that certainly just is the one that's grabbing all the headlines at the moment in the whiskey world. But the Scotch Whisky Association called the deal transformational. They believe it could export over £1 billion in the next 5 years, and create many more jobs in the UK. Although, when I say UK, let's be honest, it's probably in Scotland where the whiskey's made, where those jobs are. And the Scotch Whisky Association is very big on this, saying it opens up a long-term opportunity for Scotch to gain traction in one of the biggest drinking nations in the world. So, as mentioned, India is by volume one of the largest drinkers in the world of whiskey. But are they ones of blends, or are they ones of single malts? And that's a really big thing to firstly look at, because most, and I would say almost all, whiskey cask investment is down to single malt style of whiskey. You can get blended casks out there. They are cheaper and they are out there, but they're a lot rarer and a few and far between, to be honest. Nobody wants to invest in blends. People want to know a particular distillery. Why is that? Well, people like to know, A, where it's come from, and they like to know the character that it is, and they also like to know the kind of the cask that it's been matured in, exclusively or non-exclusively. So, as we've spoken about in other shows, first fills, refills, etc., etc. But if you've got a blended one, people know it's just been mixed around with, and is it 20% here, 10% there? Is it 10% mixed with a 5-year-old whiskey, and then another 20% mixed with a 30-year-old whiskey? Like it just gets a bit inconsistent for people, and particularly when we're getting to the exit strategy, independent bottlers want to know, or any whiskey distillery want to know what's in that bottle or what's in that barrel, and you can't be consistent if you don't know particularly what's in there. And by that I mean, say if someone is short a few barrels of whiskey, just because of, as we know, whiskey is a aging process. It takes years to make. If 20 years ago they stopped making it for whatever reason, let's just say COVID, although that wasn't 20 years ago, but let's just extrapolate that. And then all of a sudden they want to bottle 10,000 bottles of a particular style of cask. They can't use a blended one because they don't know what's in it. But if they want to use a single malt, they know exactly what's in it and what it's been aged for and the actual character of the distillery. So it's much more safer for distillery users and bottlers, but also I think it's just safer for investors all around. So that's the first thing to look out for. Great for blended market. Is it going to be impactful for single market, for single malt whiskies? Potentially not as much. And that's just something to keep out in mind. So when someone's reaching out to you, and they've reached out to me certainly to say, yeah, India's going to drink the world dry of whiskey now that the tariffs have gone, well, we've got to figure out what they're drinking. And, they've been drinking lots of whiskey beforehand. Doesn't mean that they're necessarily going to go overboard and drink even more now, but certainly the access is there for them. And potentially, if the blends are significantly cheaper and people now have access to single malts, which always demand a more premium price, then absolutely the price of cask whiskies, the price of single malt whiskies are going to go up and up and up, and the demand for them is going to go up and up and up. And if this is just in the last 5 years and the next 10 years, then we know from supply and demand, as we've been speaking, it's not like we can turn on the taps and suddenly make loads of 10-year-old whiskey. It's going to certainly create a demand, which is going to strip the supply out, and then prices are going to go up even further. As we know, lack of supply increases demand. But here's kind of the 3 reasons I would offer a little bit of skepticism to the whole Scotch whisky industry and the Scotch whisky tariff thing being the best thing ever for the whisky industry and significantly increasing prices across the board. One is India still has the highest Scotch tariffs in the world. So even though 150% down to 75% is a massive drop, 75% is still the highest in the world for whiskey consumption. For comparison, Hong Kong has brought its tariffs down to 10%, and Japan and EU have none at all. So having a 75% tax is still insane. I mean, if you flip that point of view the other way around, instead of thinking how much it's been reduced by 75%, imagine saying there is a 75% tax on whiskey in India. I mean, yes, the price has come down, but it's still a significant cost to a lot of people, and it's not something that's just going to be sought after overnight. So that's the first thing. They've still got a massive amount of tax on all of their whiskey. So it's not like there's nothing on it anymore and everybody's going to go crazy for it. The 75% import duty is just the start of how their tax system works. So I'm going to caveat this by saying I am not a tax expert. I am not especially an India tax expert. But to break it down roughly, India tax system has multiple layers of local charges differentiating by region, whether in Calcutta, Mumbai, Rajasthan, wherever you may be. And each of those states or territories can add, I think, an additional 100% on top of that tax again. So not only do you have this overall blanket tariff, you have regional tariffs that get added as well. And so regional tariffs could be 100%. And so whilst it's gone down by, again, 75%, which is great overall, there's still a massive tariff out there for people to pay. So it's not instantly making it cheap for everybody. You know, if we think about this from a, I don't know, let's do something crazy, a super yacht point of view, right? A super yacht might come down from £100 million to £80 million. You know, wow, 20 million, 20% off. But there's not really a massive market for it. Now that's extreme, of course. But, you know, whiskey's not a cheap alcohol alternative, especially compared to, you know, just everyday beer and some other cheaper spirits out there like vodka and gin. And so it has got that kind of premium to it. So it's got regional taxations as well. To kind of put them into perspective monetary wise, you can expect a bottle of scotch that's £100 in the UK can go up to £300 in India. So the true impact of this tariff is still really not kind of 100% clear. Yes, tariffs in general are a great thing for trade. If you reduce them and we get lots of more free trade around the world. I'm certainly a free market person myself, and I would want zero taxes around the world and free market trade everywhere. But it's not as simple as now we've got reduced tariffs, we're going to get an exponential or the same amount of increase in sales in that region. And the third one is India is built for volume, not value. I mean, I've said this a couple of times before, but to give you kind of some stats behind that, India consumes over 2 billion bottles of whiskey a year, which is crazy. If you think about that number. There is over a billion people there, but that's 2 bottles of whiskey per person. Now, I'm assuming a lot of those people are either under 18, so they're not going to drink those. So it's even less than you think. But even still, over 2 billion a year is a crazy amount to drink. And mostly Indian-made whiskey is what's drank out there, distilled from molasses, not barley. So a bit different to the Scottish style that has the barley style to it and grain component. But premium Scotch single malt doesn't really blip their market at all because they're so geared up towards their local whiskey making and this kind of molasses based whiskey. Grain whiskey and malt whiskey hasn't really penetrated it, especially from Scotland. Mainly due to the tariffs, of course, but still, if that's what you're used to and that's what you enjoy, your flavour, are you going to transition all of a sudden? Certainly some people might, but if that bottle is £200 and now it's only £100 compared to your whiskey that you normally drink that's £30, you're still not quite bridging that gap. Yes, it's going to be more accessible, but it's not something you're buying on a regular basis again. Another kind of some stats out there about volume is Johnnie Walker's Indian sales only account for 0.5% of their total whiskey consumed out there. So Johnnie Walker, most people, I would assume, have heard about this from the show, but they're the biggest Scotch whisky brand for blended whiskey. And the fact that they're the big boys and everybody is the most brand recognized whiskey out there, and they're only 0.5%, you could see it from one of two ways. One, they're not that big, so not many people drink it. Or B, actually, there's lots of potential customers out there who could go for Johnny Walker, because they've only got 0.5% market penetration. If they get that up to 5% and 10 times that, that is a massive amount of increase in Scotch whisky. But are people going to switch? That's up for debate. I'll let you come to your own conclusions and maybe ask friends if you've got them in India, or do some online research as whether you think people are going to switch on that. But I'm just going to switch gears just to kind of focus back on kind of what the show's all about in terms of whiskey investment and what that means for investors. But this deal does show intent. Like, it is a good thing. And I do think overall it is going to have a positive effect and an increase in demand for Scotch whisky. To what extent? Not sure. I can't give you a value. I can't say that something that normally goes up 8% a year for your returning on a whiskey suddenly now going to be 10%. I have no idea. And I don't think anybody out there can give you a definitive answer. The best way to kind of think about this is just like an economist. I studied economics at university. You have people on both sides. Some people can say one thing, some people can say the other thing. They can be right at the same time. And then you only get the data 2 years later, and by the time you've figured it all out, and you can say this person was more right than the other person just because of some other factors that you've built into your assumptions that the other person didn't. So whilst the impact is going to be positive, to what extent remains to be seen, is the way I would look at it. But if you are a cask investor or you're looking to enter the whiskey market, take this news as a reminder to ask deeper questions. I've spoke about this for potential pitfalls, as people need to ask brokers and people selling barrels of whiskey certain types of questions. Dig behind the surface. Don't just get drawn into this big show and say, hey, this thing costs now 75% less in regions, therefore we're going to make 75% more money. It's a lot more complex than that. And hopefully through listening to my show and other things like that, you gain the knowledge to kind of empower yourselves to make sure you stay on the right side of all of that. But who benefits most is the best way, or a good way of thinking about this. Are producers actually expanding into India at scale? I mentioned Johnny Walker have only got 0.5% penetration. Are they going to look at that and go, right, this is our number one market now, our number one target? Or actually, do they not really care that much? And do they look for other markets? Now, granted, the US have imposed some tariffs, so maybe their other biggest market for single malts might not be one that they're chasing, and they could see India as a biggest potential growth opportunity. But is it something that producers are actually going to go after? I don't have the answer for, but that's something that you've got to think about in your calculations. And another thing is your barrel or is your cask that you've bought popular in that country? Now, the way I can explain that is there's over 200 distilleries in Scotland. If we remove blends, I know we've spoken about blends in terms of volume, but let's just remove blends from this conversation because it makes it a bit clean of an argument. If I take Macallan, for example, are whiskey drinkers in India after Macallan, or is that their flavour profile, the one they enjoy, or do they prefer Glenfiddich, or do they prefer Dalmore? Is there a certain whiskey distillery that has more brand penetration? I don't know. You should certainly dig into the internet a bit more and have a look to see who's the number one. But that's what you need to think about. If all the kind of India market loves Macallan and nobody likes Dalmore, then probably don't buy any Dalmore casks if you're thinking you're going to make money in that one, and vice versa. But the other way, if you were thinking about it from a skepticism point of view, is this just another angle to sell more barrels of whiskey to you? I mean, I'm sure everybody's good intentioned when they want to sell you barrels of whiskey, but we have seen in the news and we have spoken about on the previous shows about people being caught out from rogue traders, shall we say, and people not setting up fake companies and taking advantage of the whiskey hype. Is this just another sales tactic to get you that emotion and get you into that kind of, mode of I just want to buy it. If I don't buy it now, it's never going to be like this ever again. The deal was just signed. Whiskey takes many years to go for, to produce. I don't think you need to panic just yet, but you should certainly start considering what kind of barrels you should be looking for. So overall, very, very positive, but don't be kind of pushed into salesman and fall into the trap of, if I don't get it now and fear of missing out, I'm never going to get a type of investment like this ever again. It's still going to be there. There's still going to be other whiskey being made, and there's always other opportunity, I would say, in the market to get great barrels of whiskey to invest in. The reality is, India remains a complex protectionist market, and while some brands like Diageo, guys who own Johnny Walker, Pernod Ricard, guys who own Ballantine's, already dominate there, and there may not be push for broader reforms, given that they're already winning in the current system. I mean, they're talking about reducing tariffs further, but are then local whiskey producers just going to roll over and just take this lying down? I'm sure they're going to lobby for their own governments and get them removed, and increase the tariffs again, and make sure that they're number one. So it is a very highly protectionist market, and as I mentioned earlier, it is the largest taxed tariff in the world for Scotch whisky. So it's not like they've opened the floodgates entirely for them. So some closing remarks and some closing thoughts, just to kind of summarize some of the conversations and some of the topics I've kind of gone through today. Is the India tariff cut big news? Yes. Is it industry-defining news for the Scotch whisky market? Potentially. Should you rush to invest in whisky casks because of it? Definitely not, without doing your homework. But is it positive overall and could lead to potentially further increases in sales, but also further increases in demand for your whiskey? Absolutely it can. But to what extent, I think, is the bigger question. And that's where you need to figure out what barrels you want to invest in, what types of barrels you want to invest in, whether the barrels you're buying, that producer is targeting that market or not. And think about it from a tariff point of view. It's 75% still. How much penetration is that? Yes, it's come down from 150, but think about it the other way. I'm adding a 75% tax. How much are people really going to go for it? It's still not one that most people will go for. If you told someone here that there's a 75% tariff on any good, it's really going to put people off buying that type of good, because they'll assume that cost is passed on to them and they'll find alternative substitutes very quickly. So we owe it to ourselves as the whiskey community, and to us as investors especially, to get through the noise, cut through that, listen to people like the Scotch Whisky Association, sure, and more recognised authorities, not just myself, from industry experts and so on. But let's not over celebrate too much. Celebrate the tariffs being reduced. Absolutely, this is a good win, I think, for all. But let's not celebrate the spin, shall we say? I think that's a good way of looking at it. But that's it for the first show that's live on video. For those of you watching on YouTube, thank you so much for listening today. Those are kind of my thoughts about the India trade deal that's gone on. Certainly a very interesting time for the Scotch whisky world and for investors alike. I welcome anybody to listen to what's been going on. And those are just kind of my thoughts out there, where, yes, great thing for the industry, but let's not kind of run away with it now and say we need to spend all of our life savings just yet on whiskey because you're going to be a millionaire in 2 years. It's a slow process. It's not something that is done overnight, as I keep mentioning, but it is overall, I think, very, very good news. It's a great first step forward, and hopefully in the near future, maybe not the 10 years down at 40%, maybe in that 10 years we might even get it down to 5-10% or even zero eventually, which will be a massive win for the Scotch whisky industry. And then for sure you will see, I think, a lot more market penetration from Scotch whisky distilleries. Thank you very much for listening. Thank you very much for tuning in. It's been a fantastic first show. There's many more fun shows coming up. I've got tasting sessions coming up. I've got guest speakers coming on. I've got more shows about the latest whiskey news, and then just kind of some more kind of updates about what stuff I've invested in and what the kind of current state of the market is. So thank you so much for tuning in. I really look forward to kind of continuing these shows. Thank you for your patience. I've had a lot of people reaching out of when the first show's done, and thank you for listening, and see you on the next one. Thank you and good night.